Hello viewer, welcome to this very informative session where we're going to look at types of chemical bonds and specifically the ionic bond. But before we do that, I want to take you back a little bit to something that you already know, and that is an atom, an ion, and the difference between an atom and an ion. So what is an atom? An atom is the smallest component of an element. The very smallest component of an element. You could also think of it as the smallest unit of matter. And you know, matter can be liquid, it can be solid, it can be a gas. Take for instance, a biscuit like this. These are solid. Now, my question to you is, how small do you think we can make this biscuit? If I wanted to share this biscuit with as many people as possible, how many people would it be possible to do that with? Now, if I crush this biscuit and I continue crushing it and I continue crushing it, believe it or not, this is still not an atom because I can still see it. An atom is so small that to see it you need a special type of electron microscope. Let us now ask ourselves what an ion is. Now, when an atom gains either a positive or a negative charge, then it becomes an ion. And this could happen because the atom either loses electrons or it gains electrons. Remember this, anytime an atom loses electrons, then it ends up having more protons than electrons. That kind of an atom becomes positively charged. A positively charged atom is called a cation. It is a cation. Now, to remember this, just remember this, a cat, okay? What does a cat do? It purrs. Now, purrs, letter P, positive. I think that's an easy way to remember it. A cat purrs, positive. So, a positively charged ion becomes a cation. What about one that gains electrons and it ends up having more electrons than protons? That kind of ion is negatively charged. Because remember we said that electrons have a negative charge. So what do you call a negatively charged ion? It is called an anion. So just remember anion, a negative ion. Becomes very easy to remember that. So let us now come back to ionic bonding. Now, ionic bonding is a type of chemical bonding that occurs when you have a metal and a non-metal reacting. Remember this, anytime you have a metal and a non-metal reacting, metals tend to lose electrons and non-metals tend to gain electrons. And remember, oxygen has a tendency of gaining 2 electrons, but we'll do that in a later video. Today, I want us to look at 2 elements. One of them is sodium, which is a highly reactive metal, and the other one is chlorine, which is a greenish-yellow poisonous gas. We are going to react the 2 of them, see how they are going to exchange electrons, and how they are going to become either positively or negatively charged. Now, if you take a look here, we have 2 elements. One of them is sodium, the other one is chlorine. The symbol for sodium is Na, like we have there. The atomic number is 11, and the mass number is 22.99. Now, because we have an atomic number of 11, that means that in the nucleus we have 11 protons. And remember that protons are positively charged. Because we have 11 protons, we also have the same number of electrons. So the electrons are also 11. Remember that electrons are negatively charged. Now, when you have the same number of protons and electrons, it is kind of like having plus 1 minus 1, which gives you a 0. That's why we call these as neutral. The atom is neutral. It does not have any kind of charge. Now, to get the neutrons, the number of neutrons here, what we do is we take this mass number and we subtract the atomic number. In this case, the mass number is 22.99, but you cannot use it like that. You have to round it off. When you round it off, then you get 23. And then you subtract 11, which is the atomic number. And you get a 12. So the number of neutrons in the nucleus here are 12. And the number of protons are 11. So it's very important to remember that. Finding the number of neutrons in chlorine is the same way. Now, if you look at chlorine, we have an atomic number of 17. Then we have the mass number, 35.45. That means you have 17 protons, and you also have 17 electrons. Now, to get the number of neutrons, just like we have done with sodium, then you need to take the mass number, which is 35.45, round it off, you get 35. So we have 35, you subtract 17, and you get 18. So the number of neutrons here are 18. So the protons are 17, the neutrons are 18. Now, if you look at these two elements, you realize that there's something awkward with each of them. Let's start with sodium. Sodium is a very, very unhappy atom. Why is it unhappy? Because look at its farthest, the outermost energy shell, which is the valence shell. Now, it only has one electron. And you know, it is like every atom's goal in life to have a complete valence shell. So it is very unhappy. Look at chlorine, the same thing. Chlorine is very unhappy because it does not have a complete valence shell. So what happens when the two react is very simple. Remember that chlorine is a gas, it is a non-metal, and sodium is a metal. And we have said that when you take a non-metal and a metal and you react them, then you expect the metal to give the electrons and the non-metal to gain the electrons. And the same thing is going to happen here. Chlorine will take these electrons that you have on the outer shell, and it is going to come here where we had a space. Now, if you take a look at the two of them, then they're very happy atoms. Now, you may wonder what happens to these shell that we have here with sodium. Now, anytime you don't have an electron or a number of electrons on this outermost shell, then the shell simply disappears. And if you look at chlorine, it has 8 on the outermost energy level, which is the valence shell. It has 8 and it has 2. So let us count the number of protons and neutrons, okay? Now, if you take a look at the two elements, then you realize that a certain change has taken place. If you look at sodium, remember that initially we had 11 protons and 11 electrons. But sodium has lost 1 electron, so it has a net charge of +1 because it has more protons, 1 more proton than the 10 electrons that it has. If you look at chlorine, you realize that initially it had 17 protons and 17 electrons, but it has gained 1 electron, so now it has 18. Now, this is a net charge of -1. Now, remember that any time we have a positively charged ion, because it has more protons than electrons, we call it a cation. And anytime you have an ion that has more electrons than protons, you call it an anion. That is exactly what has happened here, because sodium has become positive and chlorine has become negative. The positive one is a cation and the negative chlorine is an anion. Now, the two of them have made something quite interesting and something very common in our homes. Sodium chloride. Why am I saying it is something common in our homes? Because sodium chloride is just a fancy way of saying table salt. Common salt that you use at home. We have come to the end of the lesson. I hope you've learned a lot, and I also hope that you've had a lot of fun. Until we meet again, have a nice day.